All right, everybody, welcome to another episode of the Break the Rules live stream. I am your host, Lev Polyakov, and we are here today for a very, very special and very important episode with JP Lindsey, Clint Russell, aka Liberty Lockdown. We're going to be talking about JD Vance's speech, talking about all these problems that are going on in Europe. And we are also going to be talking about the Ukraine deal. For those who don't know, Joseph, you are in Ukraine right now. You've been in Ukraine since the very beginning of this thing. You started your career working at Fox News and other mainstream outlets, and you even wrote a book about Fox News, about Roger Ailes and all of that. And Clint, you are coming at this, as many of the people watching this show know, from a libertarian anarcho-capitalist perspective, but you have been a lot more on the Trump side, although I am kind of interested what somebody libertarian like yourself thinks of that latest quote that he talked about. He who saves his country does not violate any law. Clint, as a libertarian, I just wanted to start out. What are your thoughts on that?
I mean, it really, like, the proof is in the pudding type of deal. Like, what does he actually mean by that? I mean, if you're functioning under a tyrannical government, I think that, like, you can't violate the law because the law is unjust. So, I as an anarcho-capitalist, I tend to agree with him. But because Trump isn't an anarcho-capitalist, it concerns me to hear him say that, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Well, first I'll say I think in some ways, probably domestically, Clint and I might agree on more more than it might seem, for sure. But when I saw that, exactly as Clint said, I thought. I mean, I very much believe in following the Constitution, more so than most, I think. But there is a sense where, you know, Trump is trying to make some almost kind of dramatic revolutionary stand in that statement. So a bit for concern, you know, cause for concern, but we have to be vigilant, as all people should be in a free republic. When you said, Clint, when you said anarcho-capitalist, you know, and actually, I think it's one thing that I've really found here in Ukraine. There is this deep tradition of anarchy, but not, I think, as we would usually define it. There was a famous Ukrainian called Nestor Makhno, and he's considered by sort of outsiders as an anarchist. But it was an anarchy based on local rule, the rule of community and family, people able to govern themselves. He's from a village called Polya in Zaporizhia. It's right. I mean, it gets bombed all the time. I visited it during an attack, and I've seen this type of what you could call anarcho-capitalism play out here in Ukraine during these past years, especially in 2022. When the Russians started the full-scale invasion, the government was not prepared, and it was the people, you know, just in their own little groups doing everything they could to resist. And we continue to see that today, especially with the drone tech and the drone innovation. In fact, there's a big conference coming up here in Kyiv. It is the little cells of people that, you know, gather together. You know, like, oh, I got a friend who's an engineer. I got a friend who's got some money. Let's see what we can do. That's still continuing here in a great way. And so Ukraine is very much a bottom-up society, and I think that's the reason why Ukraine has been able to resist. And outsiders might call that a type of anarchy, but there is definitely a deep order to it. And so, you know, one of my great mentors at the University of Notre Dame, he believed in a political philosophy of a bit of anarchy, as long as you have some kind of moral principle to govern yourself. That was Alistair McIntyre. And so in Ukraine, this is sort of understudied and underappreciated, but this is a whole new type of politics here that we're so unaccustomed to in our bureaucratic West, whether Europe or the U.S.
For sure. No, I mean, that's very interesting. I'm not familiar with the Ukrainian gentleman that's practicing kind of this or popularizing this anarchist worldview. But yeah, I think that anarchy ultimately, at its core, at its best variation or version of it, is just really mandatory for any level of freedom. Like, you have to have, and also for a kind of a meritocratic hierarchy that arises naturally as opposed to being a forced one. So, but yeah, just to clarify my position on Ukraine as well, like I'm not rooting for Russia, you know, like, just oftentimes I get accused of that because I don't want to fund this war. But like my concern is America. My concern is that we are $37 trillion in debt, and that we've practiced decades of militarism and military adventurism all throughout the world, but particularly the Middle East. And I do not appreciate being robbed to fund wars, even if they are just defensive wars, which I'm sure you feel this is one of those cases. We can get into that if you'd like, but that's I just come from like a pure America first, non-interventionist position. This is not our business. I want to stay out of it. That's why I appreciated JD Vance's speech yesterday, because it seemed as if he was more embracing the nationalistic approach as opposed to the globalist one. And with America being the policeman of the world and the military of the world, I think that it's desperately needed, lest we end up watching our empire collapse in a violent, death row.
Clint, actually, I agree completely with you on this. Actually, my first job before I went to Fox News, which was a bizarre story and experience. After university, I was sort of hired without even applying for it at the Weekly Standard. Bill Kristol and the War Machine, the people that started the Institute for the Study of War, the people that pushed for Iraq and Afghanistan. That was my first job, and I went in there sort of naively. I came from more sort of ideologically of the old school of American conservatism, like paleocons. But the Weekly Standard was a cool place to be, and I saw it up close, and I rejected it. I mean, I escaped Fox News in a car chase. I began, when I saw it up close, I rejected the war machine, the forever war machine, and I along with many of my friends that fought in Iraq and Afghanistan, like together we began to wake up and say, wait, this is not right. Everything you just said, and as Trump just said, I think yesterday or today, the wars in the Middle East, there were too many, no one should have died on either side, and so I rejected that. I want to have nothing to do with it. I see this story in Ukraine as totally different, and I don't see it actually as taxing American resources. I mean, and that's one thing where the Biden administration was, to me, is sort of unconsciously dishonest. All the spending packages for Ukraine, most of that was the valuation of weapons, old weapons that we weren't using anyway, or weapons that we wanted to test. And a lot of that stayed home. I mean, a lot of that was money that was spent in those packages to buy new weapons for the Pentagon. And still, I have yet to see a study today that shows if there were no Russian war in Ukraine today, how much money would the Pentagon be spending on new weapons? Because they're always buying new weapons. And what happens is all that gets shoved into the Ukraine package. So Ukraine gets blamed for it. These are the usual Washington shenanigans, which it seems that maybe we're on the edge of trying to get rid of. But I would. So I agree with you. The foreign adventures in Iraq and Afghanistan were disastrous, and I despise them. And that's why every time someone like Lindsey Graham or Bill Kristol speaks up in favor of Ukraine, I say, please be quiet. This is something totally different. This is not democracy building. This is something very different. And you have an army here that will do the fighting and actually is testing American weapons. And the thing that is still being missed by Pete Hegseth and by Elon and others, the pace of innovation that's happening here is astounding. And every defense contractor I've met who comes here, they close their eyes. They don't want to see it because it means they're going to have to do a lot of hard work when they go back to the U.S. They're making a lot of money making stuff that's not really useful for us, and Ukraine sort of proves that reality.
Well, I mean, I disagree with much of that. In that, I'm still very concerned with the State Department's activities in Ukraine in the lead up to Russia's invasion. I think that there has been tremendous provocation. I don't know if you've had an opportunity to read Provoked by Scott Horton at this point. I'm sure you would disagree with much of it, but he goes through painstakingly and he uses citations largely from the major corporate media in America, New York Times, Washington Post, and he demonstrates the narrative shift that happened in 22 when the invasion occurs. Or was it 22 or was it 21?
2022, right?
Yeah. And it's like all of the non-interventionist arguments that me and my libertarian camp make was justified totally by our perceptions based off of corporate reporting prior to 22. It was like there was this acknowledgement that, yes, Ukraine's extraordinarily corrupt and that, yes, Russia is adamantly opposed to NATO's expansion and to admitting Ukraine into NATO and that it's the reddest of red lines, as they said. Our State Department was well aware of that, and we continued to push that envelope despite the fact that we knew that at some point Russia would do this. And whether you believe that Ukraine is just in their defense, which I tend to believe that they are, it does not change the fact that the U.S. and NATO was extraordinarily provocative towards Russia, and that if you were to just do the the foot or the shoe on the other foot type of analysis of this thing, America would never stand for this. We would never stand for Russia doing to us what we've done to them, and that we would absolutely invade Mexico or Canada if the roles were reversed. So that is my perception on it. That there has been, thanks to our, I perceive this as a continuation of military adventurism that's in alignment with the same wars that I rejected in Afghanistan and Iraq, which you rejected as well. I think that the provocations that led to Russia's decision, we bear some serious responsibility and culpability for those, and I just reject it all. And I don't want to be participating in it anymore. I don't want to be funding it. I want to be negotiating peace, and I think that we have an opportunity to do so under Trump round 2.
Well, and as you say that, I mean, I think of, to go back to the Cuban Missile Crisis, right? I mean, obviously you're right. USA would not tolerate, as Kennedy could not, something like that in our backyard. But I think here's where I have a problem with legacy media and their reporting. If you actually look back, there was no desire for Ukraine to be part of NATO from Washington at all, especially during Biden. In fact, Joe Biden, more than ever, he was always calling Ukraine corrupt, never calling Russia corrupt, by the way, but always putting this label of corruption on Ukraine. And in 2021, when Biden came to office, he made it clear there was no desire whatsoever for Ukraine to be in NATO. And so I think that Putin used that argument, knowing that it would resonate with Americans who are rightly frustrated with American meddling. But if from the Ukrainian side, I kind of understood it maybe because I'm Irish American, so I know the history of how the English were oppressing the Irish for centuries. It's the same thing with the Russians and Ukrainians. Ukrainian language was illegal and the religion was illegal for 300 years. This is a long struggle that was going on well before NATO even existed. So there's something deeper there. But I would say if you go back and search the headlines from 2020, 2021, and there really was no sense that Ukraine was moving anywhere near NATO. That had been a topic since 2008, and nothing was happening. And I see, one of these sticking points of showing that the proof of American meddling, which Elon Musk seizes upon. He tweets about this at least once a week. Is Victoria Nuland, the epitome of American. She and there was that famous leaked call from 2014 from Ukraine's Maidan Revolution, which, by the way, as I got to understand the revolution and to meet a lot of people who were there, to me that was like the Ottawa truckers times 100 million. It was the same desire or what we see now with Doge. It was desire to get rid of the Soviet control and deep state. But because of this, so Victoria Nuland is seen as that she was the instigator of it, that America was trying to create the revolution. But if you zoom in and look more closely, if you listen to that leaked call, she was trying to manage the revolution in the typical American bureaucratic way, just like George H.W. Bush in 1991 when he came to Kyiv after the breakup of the Soviet Union. In a speech written by warmonger Condoleezza Rice, he urged Ukrainians not to have their freedom. Because freedom is a problem for the bureaucrat. They're like, keep your freedom, contained a little bit because you're going to cause us problems. And that was the attitude of the U.S. government in 2014 of Obama Biden. And Biden was really running Ukraine policy, and we can go into that more later. But Nuland her task was to contain the revolution and to get the protesters to make an agreement with the regime that they hated. And in fact, I was just speaking with a Ukrainian member of parliament a few days ago. She just moments ago or hours ago, she asked General Kellogg a question in Munich, and she was in the room with Victoria Nuland and Vitaly Klitschko, the boxer, before he was mayor. And she said Nuland is horrible. She was like American imperialists telling the protesters, you gotta make a deal. And when the deal was formed, the people in the square were told, and they said hell no. And so actually what happened is the regime fell against the wishes of against the attempts of Victoria Nuland to control the situation. And I think if the world saw that, it would be, Russia has pushed this narrative so gleefully because they listen to Americans and they know that we're pissed off after 20 years of Iraq and Afghanistan. But I would say what I see here in Ukraine, this is the inversion of it. Supporting Ukraine is actually, sorry, go ahead.
No, I just wanted to interject because we have a few significant areas of disagreement. Your point about like the the position of the Biden administration is not exactly correct, because it was, first off, the prerequisite to be added into NATO is that you have to diminish corruption. So oftentimes what you're saying is true, that Biden was emphasizing the corruption that existed within the Ukrainian government, and they needed to work on that. The reason they were saying that is because they were creating a pathway for Ukraine to be admitted into NATO. And it's not just me theorizing on this. Kamala Harris said this, I think it was the Munich Security Conference of late 21, which was just months prior to the invasion from Russia, where she says, yes, the door remains open to Ukraine, into NATO. And that was extraordinarily provocative. And I don't think it was an accident, despite the fact that I think Kamala Harris is virtually retarded. I think that she was reading from a script. I think she was told to say that. Now, could I be wrong? Maybe. I can't prove that, but she did say it. And I think that was a major shot across the bow at Putin, particularly given that they were already kind of like rounding up or preparing for a potential invasion. To say that in that junction was like, yeah, bring it on. Like, we're calling you out. Also, I don't, look, I'll have to trust on some of your on the ground reporting and your conversations with parliamentarians in Ukraine as to their experience with Victoria Nuland and whether or not the revolution actually went against State Department interests. But I think it stands in contrast to the fact that they spent many years prior to that funneling billions of dollars into the NGO frameworks, the National Endowment for Democracy and others, that essentially bought and controlled so much of the media in Ukraine for Western interests and counter to Russian interests. So it seems obvious to me that, in fact, we were trying to ply Ukraine away from Russia interference or influence or whatever you want to call it. Now, as to the merit of that phone call and if she was actually crafting or trying to control the revolution, I think you and I are probably just going to be at odds on what the nature of that call was. But it didn't come across that way to me. I mean, she's talking, anybody that hasn't heard it, I would encourage you guys to listen to it. She's talking to, I think it was Jeffrey Pyatt, and it sounds as if she is basically deciding who's going to be in the new government post-revolution. That is the interference that I think America has been participating in most of the rest of the world, not just Ukraine, obviously, for a very long time, and it has created tremendous damage. And sometimes you have blowback. I'm sure you're familiar with this term from Ron Paul or the CIA, and I think that this is a very good example of it, that this was blowback to our intervention in Ukraine, and as a consequence, hundreds of thousands of people have died. And I think that it could have been avoided, and I think it's a tragedy. But at the end of the day, I'm not interested in participating in it anymore. I'm not interested in funding it, despite the fact that it is our excess or our ancient military technology that we're shipping out that we would have replaced anyways. It's still a massive and extraordinary provocation to the largest nuclear power on Earth, which is Russia. I mean, it's if not second to us. And it's we all understood that during the Cold War, you cannot have proxy wars, or certainly not hot wars, between nuclear powers. And we've just completely done away with that obvious truth, and we've participated in a obvious proxy war against Russia for years now. And I just think it's one of the most dangerous things I've ever witnessed. And despite the fact that I have tremendous sympathy for the Ukrainians, I mean, the primary reason that I reject the intervention into Ukraine in the first place is because I have a lot of sympathy for the Ukrainians. That doesn't change the fact that I don't want to risk nuclear war to defend them, to fund it, or to arm it, or to intervene in it in any fashion. And I think that I'm much more reflective of the general, America First MAGA base, despite the fact that I only broke down and voted for Trump for the first time in my life 4 months ago. I think that we see this thing quite similarly. Sorry, that was quite a screed, so I'll let you hop in whenever you want.
A lot of what you say resonates. Now, first, I would say, no matter what Kamala said in the days before the full-scale invasion, the biggest thing was the actions of the Biden administration. Now, there's a very important at some point to go back and see what happened in 2014, because there were a lot of shenanigans. And actually, Biden's son was getting paid by a pro-Russian, anti-Ukraine company, which no one seems to understand. We can get to that. But firstly, a few weeks before the Munich Security Forum and before the full-scale invasion, Biden withdrew the U.S. Embassy from Kyiv. It was anything but a tough policy. It was almost an invitation. And as we all knew here the first few days, and I knew from my contacts in D.C., Washington And I think Paris and Berlin and others were hoping that Ukraine would fall because the problem would go away. They didn't want to defend this. They did not want to provoke Russia at all. They have a consistent policy of Hillary Clinton reset button appeasement. It was Trump that was tough. It was Trump who, despite all the blah 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 propaganda, he gave Ukraine javelins, which were super essential during those early weeks of resistance because Trump had given them to Ukraine. It was actually, despite all the propaganda, it was Donald Trump that gave Ukraine weapons, javelins, when he was president. It was Donald Trump that sanctioned Russia on the Nord Stream pipeline, and he was accused of harming relations with Europe because he pissed off the Germans because they wanted Russian oil. And it was Trump that told NATO, you got to get tough. And war is coming, and you're going to get invaded. And no one listened. And it was Trump who was tough, who gave Ukraine the ability to resist. And that's why I think Ukraine was not invaded under his watch. And Joe Biden not only refused before the full-scale invasion to give weapons to Ukraine, there was we held on longer in Saigon and Kabul than we held on in Kyiv. 4 weeks before the full-scale invasion, the U.S. Embassy departs. It was an invitation. There was no desire. And if you look further and you look at Joe Biden's family connections, and this is what the other thing that everyone gets wrong, including the BBC and Tucker Carlson, it's universally wrong, is Burisma. When I talk with so many American friends, including people in Congress, the main reason why they oppose Ukraine, one of them is Burisma. They're like, no wonder Joe Biden helped Ukraine because his son made money from Burisma. Well, the CEO of Burisma, this energy company, was a member of the pro-Kremlin Yanukovych government in 2014. He fled the country. And as Hunter Biden's business partner, Devin Archer, said in congressional testimony in summer 2023, Hunter Biden's business partner was in Moscow in March 2014, meeting with the CEO of Burisma the same day that Putin took Crimea. Burisma had its major gas fields in the Crimean Peninsula. Burisma wanted Ukraine's revolution ended. They wanted Russian control again, as they had before. And what did they do to get influence? They paid the son of the United States vice president, who was given the Ukraine portfolio because Obama didn't really care about that foreign policy. They paid him $50,000 a month. And guess what? It worked. Because Obama Biden sent some blankets and MREs. They sent nothing to Ukraine, despite all these promises from before. And so I think if you start to look at it that way, you'll see that actually Biden, his family was incentivized for years by Moscow to oppose Ukraine. When Russia made its threats, the CIA, the intel was great about the threat that Russia posed. And they warned Ukraine it's going to happen, and they ran away. They didn't do a damn thing to stop it. And the one thing that the intelligence, and this is one reason why I really don't like the intelligence agencies, is their arrogance. They all thought Ukraine would fall in 3 to 7 days because they can never factor in the fact that there are human beings on this earth that love freedom and will not surrender. That's not a bureaucratic mindset. And so I just put those. I mean, there's a lot. I'll pass it to you now because there's a lot more we can discuss. But that's my basic response to what you said.
Yeah. Well, I think we read this a little bit differently. So that's why I analyze these things in a different fashion. I think that there's a distinct possibility that, well, perhaps the Biden administration or the Obama administration was not really interested in seeing Russia invade. I think that there are countervailing forces within our establishment, the deep state, as Donald Trump would refer to them, that were very much interested in seeing Russia invade Ukraine for the exact purpose that you're describing, that they want to test out weaponry. They want to bleed their top enemy from their perception from this, very ancient old Cold Warrior type of mentality that, Russia's an imminent threat to us or some bullshit, which I totally disagree with. But I do think that there are forces within the United States government and the State Department in particular that were very interested in seeing Russia invade Ukraine for that exact purpose, that this is not counter to their interests or counter to their preferences at all. So while they may have withdrawn from their embassy, I still think that was more indicative of the fact that they don't want to have a hot war. They want to have a proxy war. And if Russia were to bomb our embassy, then we probably have to have a hot war. So they're looking at it like, well, we're fine with them actually doing this because we're going to have a multi-year, very bloody war that damages Russia deeply and damages their position on the world stage, which is all to their advantage because their perception or their desire for the longest time has been to divide Russia from Europe, that they want to make sure that Germany and Russia in particular are not bedfellows. And this war did an incredible job at that. And I think that it's important that we get into the Nord Stream attack, because I'm curious to hear what your thesis is on this. You would probably guess my belief is that that was ordered by the Biden administration, and I think that runs totally counter to your perception or your belief that the Biden administration didn't want this to happen, because it seems quite obvious to me that that's exactly what they did. That whether it was actually Ukrainian military that was responsible for it, or if it was Special Forces for America, it seems obvious that we did order that attack. So what's your opinion of that?
Well, I would say, firstly, Clint, on this, if you look at the first months, but really this entire past years when Biden was in power, it was not a story of an administration that seemed energized to push for a bigger war, especially at the beginning. It was so hard for Ukrainians to get any tools from the U.S. I think there's a lot from Jake Sullivan, Biden's national security advisor, who was his security advisor in 2014, by the way. I think there's a consistent position of fear, of saying if we do anything, Russia's going to, the problem's going to get worse. And I really think that the Biden policy was very much in consistency with that of Henry Kissinger, the late Henry Kissinger, who I used to go to baseball games with and who I deeply disagreed with. But he believed that Russia was necessary in the balance of the global equilibrium, and that it must never be disturbed. And I think this, in practice, this was the policy of the Biden White House. Every single time they gave weapons to Ukraine, it was slow and reluctant. And even when Congress finally, when Republicans in Congress in 2024, I think largely due to sort of evangelical influence, began to turn around and support Ukraine. Mike Johnson, when he said, "Oh, okay, now I'm going to support Ukraine," he started to criticize Biden for not giving weapons that worked, not giving weapons with permission to use them. And so I think what we perpetually saw from Biden was a fear. Like, they want to pretend that they were doing something because they knew it was popular in the U.S. and around the world, but they wanted to do the maximum of the minimum. And we saw that routinely. And for example, every time, look at Kharkiv city, May 2024. Kharkiv, I spent a lot of time in that city. It's 30 minutes from Russia, and yet it's my favorite city. It's safer when there's no attack. That city, there's less crime. It's safer than Chicago or Los Angeles or New York or Topeka. Ukrainians have figured out how to build a nice society. It's all being, on the edge of being destroyed. Kharkiv city, this lovely place, 30 miles from Russia. In May, the Russians were pounding it. They said, okay, we're going to try to take it. We're going to try to make people flee. And there was such a unified core, and Biden was doing nothing to help. And because it's so close to Russia, he's like, you can't strike the Russians because they're on Russian soil. And there was a unified chorus putting pressure on Biden. And finally, at the end of May, he said, fine, we'll let you use American HIMARS to hit on Russian soil, which had been a nuclear red line for Putin. Within 24 hours of that happening, there were no attacks in Kharkiv for 1 whole month. The city became totally safe. The stupid legacy media, they don't report on it. They can't write they can't write on the success or the absence of a problem. And the Biden team was quiet because they were so scared. And so we could have used that moment to get stronger and to put an end to this thing. Like, instead, we crossed a major Russian red line, and instead of Russia getting stronger, they spent 60 or 30 days moving their missile launch points beyond the Biden-declared safe zone, into the Biden-declared safe zone, 150 kilometers into Russia. And then by July, Kharkiv is attacked again, although not as bad because it's from further away. No one has even analyzed that situation. And that was a huge point of Biden weakness, and I think it shows that they really were not interested in putting an end to this. And when it comes to, it is a fact, Clint, as I think you know, 2023 and 2024 were both record years. 2024 was the record for sales of American weapons to foreign countries. And so, as I see what happened here, they didn't want to do a damn thing to help Ukraine in the beginning, but they were forced by public pressure, and even also by some freedom-loving Republicans, forced to do it. But they tried to do the minimum, but then they began to see the money-making ability. And when I talk with defense contractors, and we can go into these stories later in future conversations, but many of them I've met here, they have no interest in Ukraine winning quickly. They have an interest in letting Ukraine bleed and stay alive, make Europe scared so that Poland and everyone else starts buying American weapons. We gave Ukraine, originally it was like in 2022, 23, like about 30 some HIMARS. It's like you walk into a bakery, they give you a free cookie, and then Poland comes in and buys the whole bakery. Poland bought 486 HIMARS. So Ukraine was a free sample for the defense industry. So what I argue is that Ukraine is actually like the MAGA of Europe, which it actually is in many ways, and is the in-between, and is being used and exploited by the war machine of America. But I think in a way you don't see it.
Yeah, well, yeah. You and I don't disagree on that. I think we just disagree on the reason that's happening. So your thesis was that they weren't concerned with Ukraine falling. In fact, they wanted it to fall. I totally disagree with that because it does not alleviate the issues with Russia. In fact, it just brings it into a Article 5 border as opposed to a non-Article 5 border because it would put them up to Poland. So that doesn't make sense to me at all, that you would want Ukraine to fall, in which case now Russia is on the border of Poland. That seems very counter to their interests. Additionally, the rhetoric that comes out of NATO, particularly Stoltenberg, it comes across as very ride or die and provocative. Like, these guys are taking this extraordinarily seriously. Poland as well. I disagree with you also that this was a very popular thing to do amongst Americans. I don't think it was popular until we were propagandized heavily to get in line and to support this thing, which is much the same environment that we existed in under post 9/11, where we were just propagandized very heavily. We have to go and fight, Saddam Hussein, and we have to go and fight the Taliban, even though that's not Al Qaeda. It didn't matter. I think that this was not a very popular war, and I think that the reason that you've seen such hesitancy to fund this thing is because, despite the fact that they are very much interested in seeing this war be dragged out and to allow for the military-industrial complex to rake in billions and to see Russia weakened. Oh, God damn it. I had a point, but I forgot it. Where was I going with this?
No, well, I see. Clint, I see your point. But I would say, I don't know if it was that popular, because if it was, then there would have been total support. It would have been, let's get this shit done. Let's get Ukraine the weapons. Not even to talk about sending troops.
That's the point. That's the point that I'm trying to get to, is that, all right, so the fear that you're describing, I think, is actually a rational one. Like, not irrational, a rational one. That you are not going to end this thing just because you authorize them to launch HIMARS beyond 150 kilometers or whatever, and you say, okay, you can just launch wherever you want into Russia. I think they realize that there is an actual red line. Yes, there's rhetorical red lines where you may cross it, and Putin may decide, all right, I'm not really prepared to launch a nuke, because then you put NATO in the position of deciding if they're going to launch a nuke, and it's like, this is all game theory shit. So I don't read that as cowardice. I read that as prudence, that you should not be behaving in a way that's so provocative that you just say, well, fuck it. They didn't, when they said this was their red line, it wasn't. We can do whatever we want now. Like, the answer is no. You can't actually do whatever you want. That, yes, sometimes the red line is going to be BS, but at some point, Putin's going to view it as existential, and he's going to fire in a way that tries to call your bluff, and then NATO has to now make that same calculus. Are we going to call his bluff? And it's like, all right, you know exactly what I'm describing. I'm describing the escalatory trap that you get into that leads to nuclear holocaust. And it's like, is any of this worth risking for the autonomy of Ukraine? From a Ukrainian perspective, probably. From an American perspective, fuck no. Like that's my opinion.
And Clint, your arguments there sound exactly like those of Jake Sullivan. That was his case. That's Bob Woodward. That's Jake Sullivan. I'm not judging it in that sense. I'm saying that was precisely the argument of Jake Sullivan.
Or Kissinger, for that matter.
And Kissinger, yes, the lizard.
I really like that quote from Thomas Sowell. There are no solutions, only trade-offs. And one of the things that I think is going to be very well worth for us to discuss here is, what are the potential trade-offs of a scenario where Ukraine wouldn't be supported? Because the idea, I guess, would be, well, Russia's going to maybe take more of a chunk of Ukraine than we think, and then it's going to stop. That would be maybe your perspective, Clint. I don't know. Like, there would have to be a certain perspective that would not allow for, Russia to go into Poland and the Baltics and Europe, or I don't know, maybe it would. I don't know. But the question is, like, how far are you okay with Russia going, and is there like evidence that it would go? Because if there is no evidence that it would go, then I could understand, even though I know that you wouldn't agree with that, JP, I could understand the POV of somebody who, doesn't know anything about Ukraine and would be like, you know what, I wish them the best, but it's not my business. It's a whole other conversation to talk about, well, what Zelensky's been talking about right now, after Ukraine, what happens? And again, Clint, my point of view here that it is going to keep going, but I don't know, like JP, where exactly do you see this particular situation of trade-offs? If nothing was to be done, if Ukraine were to be invaded, then I know, would Russia run out of steam, or could it actually keep going? Is that a real threat?
We do have Russian-Iranian drones. Russia sends Iranian drones to Europe now, by the way, in case people forget, and they're on the way to Kyiv City now. So what I'm doing right now is checking the different Telegram channels to see how far away they are, and there we go, just taking a look. But first I want to say, like, imagine this, that in this scary world that we're in, and with the threats of China and all that, and everything Trump wants to achieve, which getting rid of the bureaucracy has been a dream for many Americans since 1980, and no one ever did it. It was blah 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 blah. And so I fully support that. And going into this world with all the threats we face, looking at the threats Trump faced in the first administration, imagine having as your best ally the people that love you and support you the most battle experienced army in the free world, because that's what Ukraine is. They actually have this battle. Now, you're going to get to a tipping point where it's going to be weakened, but right now it still is the most battle experienced army in the free world. And
Wait, are you arguing that the Ukrainian military is not weakened at this junction?
No. In fact, here's an example. I mean, yeah, for sure. For example, that city of Pokrovsk in Donbass. If you go back to August of last year, all the experts said Pokrovsk is going to fall in 2 weeks. Everyone said it. And as always, the stupid media and the stupid experts, including the high generals, they never correct themselves. They never say, "Oh shit, it's been 6 months." Pokrovsk is going to fall, and everyone said then the major city of Dnipro was next. Pokrovsk is destroyed. The civilians are gone, but I have many friends fighting there. It still holds on. It's still holding the line. That's extraordinary. What Ukrainians have done in Kursk, Russia was so weakened that in order to get stronger, which they did, they got North Korea. So that made them stronger, but they got to a weak point. There have been ups and downs for both sides here. And what we keep doing is missing the moments when Russia is down, and even to talk about it, even if you don't want to support it, at least to recognize it. But Ukraine surely has so much to teach. I don't know if Berlin were invaded. And, this is why JD Vance's speech was so powerful. He was totally right to chastise Europe. It's weak. And Ukrainians feel that too. And if Berlin were invaded, I don't think they have the social cohesion and the identity needed to withstand that. Ukraine had it, and it was still tough. But I don't think Berlin has it. I don't think Paris has it. London, England's and the UK is an island, so they have some benefit. But Ukraine has an actual battle experienced army that would be an amazing ally, just as a practical matter for the U.S. Without actually costing the U.S. more. Actually, the U.S. has gained so much in this and has not spent a lot. But one thing I'll say, and I recognize that there is some radical sense of freedom here, which in a sense the anarchists would appreciate. Doesn't mean you have to totally support it. But there is a radical sense of freedom. And I in the 2014 Maidan protest and revolution, which some anti-Ukraine people call it a January 6th, by the way, but it was like January 6th on steroids.
It was an actual insurrection.
Yeah, but they did it. It was peaceful on the protester side. They weren't, the bullets came from the secret police, and as a result of that revolution, for 3 weeks, by the way, after the revolution, there were no police in Ukraine. All the state institutions went to Doge level of zero. There was a severance of the Soviet past. It was incredible. And the people self-police themselves. That story doesn't get told. The BBC is never going to tell you that because they're not interested. President Macron or Schultz, they never talk about that because they're scared of having a revolution in their own countries. There's a reason why they always say sovereignty and never freedom. This is Biden, Schultz, and Macron. About Ukraine, they never say freedom. They never talk about Maidan.
Usually they just say democracy. They don't even say solidarity.
Because
their favorite word, democracy.
Shit, and they never talk about the Maidan Revolution, which was the key to this, because they're terrified that would happen in their own country. And during the Maidan, when Nuland was there with her cookies and all this stuff, and everyone's trying to maneuver and have a role in it, and the foreign minister of Poland, who's once again the foreign minister of Poland, Sikorski, he said to the leaders of the protesters, he was so frustrated because they would not make a deal with the regime. And he was so frustrated, and he said these words, they're on camera. He said, "You're all going to die." And in a way, sadly, there was a lot of truth to that, because 8 years later, ballistic missiles arrived. Ukrainians, because they resisted Russian tear gas, now they have to face Russian ballistic missiles. And all I want, at least, even if people don't want to support that, to at least recognize that. Like what I don't like is that you have Elon and all these people, and JD Vance even, like, castigating these people who actually are living out the values that JD Vance wishes Europe had, where they're here in this country. And I don't. Okay, fine, you don't want to support it. That's fine, and Ukrainians can live with that. But why do you have to lie about it? Why can't you try to honor that? Because it's exactly what, like, if you go to Lviv, Ukraine, in the West, where they were able better to resist the Soviet chains, on a Sunday or any day, the churches are more crowded than any city in Europe. It's the most Catholic city. It's Catholic. It's not Orthodox. It's in the Greek Catholic, so it's Eastern style. It is the most Catholic city in Europe. The Poles pretend they're so Catholic. In Lviv, they're so Catholic, there's no argument about it. And I think it's one reason why Americans don't understand Ukraine. You don't have a left-right divide in the same way that we do in other countries. There is this genuine, sort of widespread devotion to freedom. And it's insane. I mean, even the last point on this score, if you think of what the Polish foreign minister said in 2014, you're all going to die, surrender. And they said no. And I think when I look at the city of Kharkiv, and every time I leave Kharkiv on the train, I'm thinking, what the hell was I just doing? Because it's literally Russian roulette. You can just get bombed at any time. The missiles hit before the alarms sound. And yet, it has beautiful parks and cool cafes. And one coffee shop that I used to go to was bombed in January, and a month later, they rebuilt it. Another cafe was bombed. I went there that morning. They opened at 8 o'clock on time. No one bitching. The staff was smiling. Not where you would get Starbucks in the middle of America. Like, there's such an insane spirit here. And a buddy of mine in Kharkiv, his wife was having a baby last summer. And I said, okay, of course you guys you're going to go to Kyiv or something to have the baby, right? I mean, they could go to Spain, and no, we're staying in Kharkiv. And even I didn't understand that. I said, that's stupid and insane. But that's the devotion that these people have to this idea of freedom.
Yep. Look, can I interject on that? Because I tried to make that point earlier that, like, I very much respect their fighting spirit. Very much. In fact, in some ways, I'm envious of it, that I don't think we have that in the same fashion in America or the rest of the West. It just doesn't change my analysis. Like, that's just the reality that, like, I'm in the cost benefit analysis of this thing. The cost is tremendous and the benefit is minimal. And that's my honest opinion. Now, you can feel differently, but I am. So to Lev's question about what I expect to be the resolution, and this is actually, I debated Destiny on this 2 years ago, and I said exactly what it's going to be, almost certainly. I said that it's quite clear to me that because Russia had a lease on Crimea, it was torn up in 2014. They took Crimea in 2014 as a consequence of that they are interested in building a land bridge by which they never fear losing Crimea again. That has always appeared to be the impetus. If you look at the battle lines, it does seem as if that's in fact what they're trying to secure. And I think that's probably what the ultimate resolution and peace negotiation of this thing will look like. I have never bought the thesis that this is about conquering all of Ukraine and that they're going to roll into Poland and then the rest of Europe. It just doesn't seem viable. It doesn't seem plausible. Like, it doesn't seem like they can do it. And I don't think that they have demonstrated any intention to do so. I think it has largely been, fear-mongering of old Cold War stuff, that this is what we're facing, that we're facing another Adolf Hitler or whatever. It doesn't come across as realistic to me. So if you look at after 2 years of this battle and where the battle lines are drawn, it still appears to be that like my thesis appears to be correct. Now, could I be proven wrong? Sure. Maybe he as soon as he gets the rest of Ukraine, he immediately invades Poland, and I look like a total asshole. I just don't think it's likely.
But what is needed for your mind to change on this? As far as
and invading Poland.
I know we don't have that kind of tangible evidence, but as far as things that people say, as far as the quotes that Putin and Medvedev and all these people have uttered, as well as their generals talking about these plans, my question to you, Clint, is how much is needed to have a sober look at this? And
look, I'm not going to change my opinion based off of rhetoric of hawks that exists within the Russian military, just because you have the same phenomenon in NATO. I mean, you have extraordinary hawkishness that exists within NATO, where they're like, we need to fucking nuke. Zelensky's talked about it. Like, we need to preemptively nuke Russia.
Who in NATO says that? I'm not sure we see that too much from NATO. Who says?
Well, I know Stoltenberger talks a big game.
He's gone now, anyway.
As to like. Yeah, have they actually talked about preemptively nuking? No, Zelensky is the person that I'm referencing.
And Zelensky's never talked about preemptively nuking. He's saying we need nukes to protect ourselves. But no one, and definitely not no one in NATO has said that for sure. But Zelensky.
Well, he doesn't speak English, but I did read a headline from him saying that.
He said we need nukes.
When he's normally talking, he's not speaking English. True. I was reading a translated version, but it seemed as if he was saying, like, we need to nuke. We need to nuke now.
No, definitely not. I think that would. No, he was saying we need to have nukes, which is extraordinary in and of itself. But he was saying,
okay. Well,
but there is a big difference between those and the fact that in Russia they're talking about nuking the United States nonstop. And sure, you could say, well, nuking the United States, that's rhetoric. But as far as the amount of surveys and the amount of things that they've already done, like, for example, Medvedev, the former president of Russia, was talking about how the Baltic countries also belong to Russia. He referred to Poland as being temporarily occupied. And Medvedev said that there's always going to be a chance for another conflict between his country and Ukraine after the current war ends. There is so much stuff over here. The Putin said that the Western territories were a gift from Stalin in reference to his claim that Poland wants to take Ukrainian territory.
Война надолго. Я думаю, что достаточно еще времени придется потратить. Говорить о определенных сроках. Нет, бессмысленно. Бессмысленно, да. С учетом, если определяться. Если мы говорим о Восточной Европе, которую нам придется, тогда, конечно, будет больше или дольше. То есть Украина только промежуточный этап? Да, конечно, совершенно верно. Это только начало.
And so my point is that I could read off all this stuff, and I understand that for yourself, it doesn't matter. The only thing
it just doesn't move me, because the battle lines still seem to demonstrate that what Putin in particular, his stated goal is the security of Crimea and to prevent Ukraine to be added into NATO. No,
he's always talking about the expansion of the Russian Empire all the time. He's had these so-called experts on that draw up these maps talking about the historical borders of Russia. This has been an obsession with him.
He talked about it with Tucker Carlson. I remember that to much consternation.
I tell you, Clint, I was in Lviv, before the full-scale invasion. And there was this, Putin gave a speech, and everyone at every cafe and bar in Lviv was watching it in Western Ukraine. And everyone just sort of felt this chill and got into silence. You could tell in every statement that he said, he wanted the total annihilation of all this. And it was so palpable. And in later speeches, he's even gone on these bizarre rants, including with Tucker. He said, he once went to Western Ukraine in the Soviet times when he was a KGB guy. Let's remember he was a KGB guy. And he said, they don't even speak Ukrainian there, which was not true. But he really cares about that deeply on that level. And I think, as you said with Poland, okay, we don't know, counterfactual. How can we know? Hypothetical. But imagine if, and I think this is something that, this is a point Ukrainians try to make, but it's, it's hard to see it. But if Ukraine fell in the same way that Belarus submitted to Russia long ago, they never really left the Soviet orb. And if Ukraine, and this is where at least some respect for Ukrainians, if Ukrainians had decided to act like Russians and just do whatever their government told them, because Russia is a super vertical society, there's no freedom of speech, And if they just decided to go along, instead of being like the Texas of Europe and saying, hell no, if they had gone along, Russia would have the largest country in Europe. You'd have, and this goes back to Soviet times and before. It was Ukrainian officers that were leaders in the Soviet military. Ukrainian ingenuity, a lot of the engineering was done here. It would have quite a menace for the entire world. And it's hard to see, if Ukrainians weren't so insistent on not being part of that, just what kind of hell could be unleashed upon the world. But again, it's the same with that's not evidence for you, the same way that, we don't know what would happen with Poland. So.
Yeah, it's a big question mark, and I can understand that maybe it's a cultural thing where, Clint, you grew up in the United States, and I grew up, even though I grew up in the U.S. too, like my family didn't, like they grew up in the Soviet Union, and there is more of a, let's say, focus that they have had as far as, well, what exactly is on the mind of a lot of these leaders. So have a lot of Russian-speaking people who are not on the side of Russia and are on the side of Ukraine. That's why I think like a lot of them are really worried about this stuff, because they know 100% that Russia is going to keep going. They're not like neocon, Bill Kristol types. They're just people who happen to live in that world. And their biggest problem right now is that the people who otherwise they would support 110%, if we're talking about a lot of people associated with MAGA, a lot of libertarian people, there's such a disconnect going on, which, I don't think of this as any kind of debate. I want to be able to reach out and just really try to figure out what is missing here, what can possibly be said, introduced into this conversation, just so we have a much more crystal clear idea of what comes next. Because you're absolutely right, this is super, super serious. We are talking about nuclear war, we're talking about World War III, all of this stuff, but from the different perspective, from the perspective of, if it's not stopped now, if China gives more money to Russia, if it keeps going, then we're going to be in a world of shit. And I want to avoid that.
Yeah, exactly. And I think we all agree on that. It's just is the world of shit imminent if we don't defend Ukraine to the last man? And that is the disagreement. Just for the record, well, yes, I did grow up in America. I'm still relatively aware of USSR history, and I completely understand that the Eastern Bloc nations in Eastern Europe have genuine and legitimate concern about expansionist Russia. And it's hard for me to express to them in a way that is more valid, because I didn't live through what they lived through under the communists, that I don't think that your fears are justified. And it's not so much about knowing Putin's heart as much as it is his mind, his rationality. He has demonstrated to me a level of prudence and caution with what he's done that it's not indicative of someone who's prepared to take on the rest of Europe and NATO. It doesn't seem to be that to me. There has been many opportunities where he could have escalated things against NATO, and he has chosen not to. What I have seen is the opposite, where I have seen lies that have come from the Ukrainian side and from the NATO side that seem to try and drag America into a hot war with Russia. And I've seen efforts from the Russian side to avoid that. So that to me is indicative of a country that's being ran at present from whether it's Putin or his inner circle that is not in fact interested in a hot war against NATO. I think we all acknowledge that it's almost certainly assured that if he were to invade Poland, there would be a hot war against NATO. So I just don't buy the argument that he is actually prepared to take that on. Even if Ukraine were to fall, I don't buy that argument.
Before Joseph, would the 2022 peace deal that Russia wanted to sign with Ukraine, would that in your mind be an example of the prudence?
Well,
on the part of Russia.
I thought, yeah, pragmatic. I think that
okay, and here's why. And this is, I'm sorry, this is one of those gotcha type questions.
I knew it was a gotcha. I was ready.
Yes. Yeah, good. The reason why I'm introducing this gotcha question right now is because Arestovich, who was working for Zelensky, when he was going in his rounds in the news media talking about, what a great deal that was, there was a video, and I have it, I can send it to all of you guys on my Twitter, of him talking with a Ukrainian gentleman for Ukrainian media, way before he was doing those interviews, talking about how he fell over his chair in laughter when he first saw this peace deal. Because what the peace deal did is it completely castrated the entire Ukrainian military. So Ukraine would not be able to have any kind of counter to whatever Russia would do as far as breaking any promise.
Did you go to Istanbul?
Yes.
So you came back with the negotiating party.
Yes, completely. Yes, it was successful. We opened the champagne bottle, for this because
You
it
actually opened a bottle of champagne in this.
Yes, because it was completely successful negotiations.
На экран вы видим два документа. Видел ты их или нет? Которые предлагались в Стамбуле, якобы, значит, обеспечивающий нейтралитет Украины, сам договор о нейтралитете, да, и безопасности Украины, и приложение к нему в виде, вот сейчас мы его показываем тоже, предельное количество личного состава и военной техники, которые находятся в боевом составе вооруженных сил Украины в мирное время. Ну, тут, знаешь, 342 танка, всего 85 тысяч армия вся, численность до 15 тысяч. Вот насколько ты эти документы считаешь достоверными, и, все равно они же не подписаны, я не понимаю, что их демонстрировать, если это все осталось на уровне ля-ля.
Мне считать не надо, потому что это же не секрет, я принимал непосредственно участие в переговорах с Россией, и как раз-таки военные.
Давай.
Я обсуждал эти все цифры. Все было гораздо веселее. Никаких 85 тысяч не было, чтобы ты понимал, они предлагали 45.
45 предлагали? Тоже нормально.
Да, я смеялся так, что все время сползал со стула, и это некоторым образом осложняло ведение переговоров и так далее, и так далее. Когда я в 4-й раз свалился с кресла, как они поняли, что дело так не пойдет, и мы им объяснили, что, ребята, 250 это нижний, на что вы можете надеяться.
At the end of the month, it was one question, not decision question, the question of amount of Ukrainian armed force in the peacetime.
Никаких 85 тысяч не было, чтобы ты понимал, они предлагали 45.
And President says, I could decide this question directly with Mr. Putin. This Istanbul agreement was a protocol of intentions, and it was completely 90% preparing for the directly meeting with Putin and Zelensky. It was the next step of negotiation.
What was the sequence, and how did Bucha derail that process?
I really didn't know. I know the president was shocked about Bucha. All of us was shocked about Bucha. And I was in Bucha, and the second day of the Russian forces was repelled. And he started thinking how he could provide negotiations and meet Putin directly after this. He's completely changed by face when he came in Bucha and see what has happened. A lot of people say the Prime Minister Johnson came in Kyiv and declined these negotiations with Russia, but I don't know exactly, is it true or false?
So to me, the real disconnect here is that in American media, where people talk about, oh, Russia offered these peace deals, same thing with Elon Musk saying Russia offered these peace deals and rejected it. Here we have this guy on, Russian-speaking television, Ukrainian-speaking television, saying that this was complete bullshit before he was lying to the American people afterwards. So this to me is a real disconnect. Yeah.
Here's the thing, though. Larger powers always offer peace deals that suck. That's what America's done too. I mean, we do that with the Middle East.
Yeah, but then America shouldn't say that, oh, Ukraine was foolish to reject this peace deal. If the peace deal was basically, taking Ukraine for itself because Ukraine can't defend itself,
But the American government doesn't say that they were foolish. The American government has said
no, not the American government, the American media. And
as an American person, I understand that,
yeah.
If you believe that America has the right to offer shitty peace deals because it's the greater power, well, then you just have to acknowledge the fact that, Ukraine's going to get the short end of the stick here. That's just being reasonable. It's not fair. I'm not arguing that it's fair. It's not fair.
Yeah, but that's not a peace deal. If the peace deal involves Ukraine not being able to defend itself, then you understand why it's ridiculous for anybody in the MAGA adjacent media to say that Ukraine was foolish for rejecting it. Right?
Well,
that makes sense.
I don't think that that's necessarily foolish given the loss of life that they've suffered as a consequence of not accepting it. Now your thesis would be that they intended to disarm them to then conquer them, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
100%. Because they already lied before when there was that agreement of Ukraine not having nukes in exchange for Russia, pinky swearing not to invade them. So why should Ukraine believe Russia? It doesn't make any sense.
I'm not saying that they should. I'm just saying that as a consequence of not accepting it, I think you've already lost this war. Whether or not you're going to lose your nation entirely is in doubt. But it's just being realistic. It makes me feel bad to say it, but it's just this is the reality.
Well,
and it's the same thing with the Palestinians.
On the question of being realistic, Clint, I'm curious because you said, you mentioned Putin's prudence and caution. Can you give us a few examples of his prudence and caution that we've seen these past 3 years? I really don't know.
Well, you actually cited one. Is that when Biden authorized the HIMARS to strike within Russia, instead of nuking, he decided to withdraw and pull all of his military encampments behind that perimeter, that line of the HIMARS attacks.
I think this is where we get with semantics, but also philosophy and actually the real heart of everything here that we're discussing. You can call that prudence or caution, or you could call it weakness. You could call it that when Russia, when they were pushed, when Ukraine got stronger, and I can feel it here because the city that I'm talking to you from was once under siege, and now it's safer than Los Angeles. It is statistically. You're not going to get robbed here, and you might get bombed, but low chances. And every single time when Ukraine
safer than LA, but you might get bombed. I don't know. I don't know.
But it's a low chance that you're actually, compared to the fires in Los Angeles. I mean, statistically, it's actually, it's insane, but it's true. And you're not going to get robbed or shot in the street. So you just said that it was that when those HIMARS were allowed to be used to hit Russians to protect Kharkiv in a very limited way, that it was Putin's prudence that prevented from going nuclear. But what we see crossing like 17 of these different red lines, we see that Putin, because he does want to win and he doesn't want to lose, they had to adapt because there was a moment of strength from the Ukrainian side. And so they had to move everything back, and then they started to attack again. They didn't stop attacking. They just had to regroup so they could continue the attack. I've seen only recklessness, in fact, almost like a defiant recklessness from Putin, because it seems that he thinks he can get away with it. Like, on the eve of the NATO summit, sending all, and it was, Kyiv is typically very well protected by air defense. It's almost like Tel Aviv or Jerusalem in that sense, with an Iron Dome. But Russians, when they really want to penetrate it, they send just a shit ton of missiles and drones in, and they can get through it. And that's what happened was it July 7th, the eve of the NATO summit. And you would have thought that on the eve of the NATO summit, Putin would have been demure and quiet. But instead, he hits, among other things, the children's hospital in Kyiv, a direct hit. And it was one of the worst attacks on Kyiv was that day. Why would he do that right before the NATO summit? Because he knew he could get away with it. And probably he knew he would put fear into the hearts of Washington. And I think it didn't work because the NATO summit was quite weak in response. And so look at Mariupol, a city totally erased. I don't see prudence and caution anywhere. What I do see, like if Ukrainians had not been able to fight back with good weapons, if it had just been like sticks and Molotov cocktails, Mariupol would be not the only city erased. Bakhmut, of course, Dnipro, Odessa would be conquered by the Russians. It's not prudence. It's strength and ability to stop the Russians. I don't see prudence here. I see absolute atrocities. And I look at, for example, as I go around, you go Kyiv or Lviv, and you see so many, especially young soldiers who've lost their arms and legs. This is the destruction of a society that cannot be controlled. People who, Russians put up with it. Russians are told, shut up and don't criticize the president. And they just do it. Ukrainians, they say, fuck you. Sorry. We're gonna do whatever we want. And most regimes will respond to that with tear gas, maybe bullets. And I think here, what we have here is like the most horizontal society, anarcho-capitalist society in the world, the most horizontal, and the most vertical, maybe except China. But I think Russians are much more subservient than Chinese. One reason why we see much more innovation in China. And so we have the clash of the two totally polar opposite ways to live on this planet Earth. And anyone that kind of believes in freedom, I don't know how you can sit on the sidelines of that, especially when Ukrainians are willing to do all of the fighting themselves. They actually, I think, economically have benefited the U.S. in many ways. It's a good business deal for the U.S. so far. It's not a drag on our resources. And so I have a tough time seeing the argument against it unless you just simply don't care or don't want to support free people.
But specifically with the prudence question, has the prudence been wringed out from the towel with what Joseph was talking about for yourself, Clint, or is there still prudence left that he may not have looked at?
Oh no, there's lots of examples. The Oreshnik. The Oreshnik missile that he launched it without warheads. Like, he could have. It was obviously a show of force, but he was demonstrating, like, we have capacity that we are not unleashing on you. And it's like, these are all things that if you're just dealing with an irrational madman, which a lot of people perceive Putin to be, he's not behaving in that fashion. That's what I'm describing as prudence, is like, he has the ability to escalate things in a way that would get into a hot World War III. It seems obvious to me that he's not interested in that. And I think it's obvious that the West, while they're also not interested in a hot World War III, they are not necessarily interested in peace either. So I think like both sides are behaving kind of similarly, to be honest. Provocations, taking it up to the line, but then not going further, where like there's a point of no return. And I just think it's quite obvious that he's not interested in going past the point of no return.
So Joseph, the Oreshnik, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, there was a second Oreshnik attempt, it seemed, on Kyiv about a week ago, and it failed. It landed over Russia. And pretty good evidence that was actual, because there are sort of simulated Oreshniks. That happens pretty often, just to scare people. We've had a lot of those since that first Oreshnik on Dnipro. By the way, Oreshnik is not properly an intercontinental ballistic missile. Right? It's more like a medium continental. It's not quite long. It's long range.
IRBM, intermediate range.
Yeah, intermediate range. But the second one that he did try to send, which we don't know, what the vector was, it failed on Russian soil. Clearly, yeah. I mean, he's trying to, scare people with that. But you could skip a few levels. You could do a more tactical nuke before you did that. That's never happened. I mean, we've seen every single time, like, Putin's like, I'm going to go nuclear if you use HIMARS or ATACMS on Ukrainian soil against Russians. That was crossed in 2022 using HIMARS.
See, all of these things that you're about to point out, you're going to point them out and call them weakness. I'm going to point them out and call them prudence. So, like, it's just a difference in analysis as to what conclusion you're making.
Okay,
I don't think it's weakness. I don't think it's weakness to not launch a nuke.
Okay,
I think it's prudence.
Then how about this? If we know that every time Ukraine punches back with good weapons, Russians retreat, and Ukraine gets safer, and therefore Europe gets safer, and everyone gets happier except for Putin. Putin is so wonderfully prudent. He's so wonderfully prudent that we can just kick them out and put an end to this.
Yeah, but you don't even buy that. You don't think that he's prudent to the point that he's going to accept the loss of this war.
The nuclear question is the toughest question, and it goes down to psychology.
Well, it's the fucking toughest question.
There is an analogy I could use here. So here's the analogy. Clint, I know you're not a big fan of Antifa, right? So
no.
We're not seeing Antifa members during 2020 that were, handling machine guns and gunning down, any Trump supporter they happened to see. Like, obviously there were, attacks, but that's the question, at what level the attacks were. To me, I see a similarity between Antifa, the far left, and Russia in terms of their strategy, which is they're going to keep going and they're going to do whatever it is they know that they're kind of going to be able to get away with. And the moment that they get their nose punched in, then they actually start to retreat. So that, to me, is, I think, a good similarity there.
Antifa doesn't have 6,000 nuclear weapons, though.
And that's the thing, right? That's the biggest question. Are we going to allow any country that says, well, because we have nukes and we're going to nuke you, let us take this piece of land? And if we allow that, then that's it. Game's over.
No, that's not true, though, because even from a conventional military standard, Russia has already demonstrated that without using nuclear weapons, they were able to take the eastern portion of Ukraine. It's like that is normal conventional warfare. I think it's obvious to everybody that they are the superior power militaristically, and they haven't even used the full repertoire of military equipment that they have at their disposal.
A question. I mean, yeah, they haven't used the full repertoire, and since they haven't gone nuclear, but they've used every damn other thing they got. I mean, for example, Russians, because they got so weakened, why did they turn to North Korea? Do you go to that shithole country when you're doing well? No, it's not a good thing when you got to go to North Korea. They had to turn to North Korea because they were not doing well. And yes, they took Eastern Ukraine, but they could have taken much more. They thought, and the CIA and everyone thought, that they would be here in Kyiv, and they weren't. So you got to always put it in perspective of the resistance that happened. And like before the HIMARS arrived in 2022, a new city was falling in Donbass every single week, and Joe Biden was standing aside. and a new city, Severodonetsk, Lysychansk. Bakhmut was due to fall within a week, like by July 4th or so. June 25th, finally some HIMARS arrived, and that changed the nature of the war. All of a sudden, it took 11 months for Bakhmut to fall, and Russia was stopped.
Yeah.
So that's not a superior military force. It's a bigger country, more resources, more mineral resources, more weapons, and they can't. Right now, the big fight is for a tiny little city called Pokrovsk. It's not for the Odessa or Dnipro or Kyiv. Russia is weak compared to what Ukraine's been able to do. That's a fact.
Hold on, though. I just think that's a totally unfair argument, because you're saying Russia is not the superior military force because NATO decided to ship them a shitload of fucking weaponry. Like, all right, so yeah, they were the weaker military force.
Okay, well, Russia gets drones from Iran. It gets support from China. India buys its oil to support the war machine, and it gets missiles from North Korea. What's the difference? North Korea.
Well, the difference is
I've been under North Korean missile attack in Europe because Russia gets its missiles from North Korea. I've been under Iranian drone attack. Super off. Sorry. Yeah?
I mean, I'm making your argument. I'm saying that you said that Russia was just rolling over everything until America offered them the HIMARS. So it's obvious that, yes, prior to having North Korea involved and all these other foreign powers involved, Russia was the superior force. I mean, just on a, as you said earlier, on a resources, population size, military size, they are the superior force. So if it's going to be a full-on proxy war where you have China and North Korea and Russia, and then you have all of NATO that's backing the Ukrainian side, yeah, maybe the NATO-backed Ukraine is the stronger force at that junction. But you have to take into consideration the calculus of what does that mean? Is Putin a madman? Is he prepared to accept a loss of Crimea? I don't think he's prepared to accept a loss of Crimea, and I'm not willing to find out. You, having spent 5 years in Ukraine, feel like you're willing to find out, and that every time we punch back, Putin, puts his tail between his legs and he runs away. I don't read it that way, but I'm not saying you're wrong. I don't know for a fact. I can't say definitively like if Putin is a madman. But then if your thesis is that, you can't then make the argument that they are capable of rolling through Europe. Like these are two like totally countervailing points that clash with one another. It just doesn't add up.
I think you sum it up well. It's a good separation of our differences on this, and I would say two points on that. One, on the question of rolling through Europe, I think that what the American and foreign intelligence agencies have routinely underestimated, and the media kind of underestimates, is the refusal. Like, this is a true freedom-loving, anarchic, capitalistic society. So I don't think you have that. It may be in Poland, but you don't have it in Germany. Like I don't. The magic of what kept Ukraine alive in order to get to the point of being able to get these weapons was firstly an absolute will to win among the people, and I don't think you see that in Europe. So I do that, and I think that's why European countries are scared. They're not scared enough, and that's why it was good that JD Vance is lecturing them and saying, "Find your strength." But on this other question, I think, and this is the big question we all have to ask, and that's why I appreciate this conversation, is like, if let's say that the nuclear thing is enough to make us all afraid, and Ukrainians, if you want to be batshit crazy and truly freedom-loving, as the Polish foreign minister warned them in 2014, if you want to do that, fine, good luck, but it's not our thing. Now the question is,
can I interject on that real quick?
Because last question. That's it. Wait. Does that create a principle? Does that create a principle that if you're a power-hungry school shooter of nations, which is what I consider Russia, the school shooter of nations, and I think right now, like Joe Biden was the Uvalde cops standing outside the door, is what I think, and Europe was too. But if you're dealing with a school shooter of nations, that sentence gets me banned for saying that. But if you relent to that, do you feed that tyrant so that the whole world now lives under a nuclear threat? That if Putin wants Poland or Great Britain or whatever, that's a key question, and I'd leave it there.
I agree. That is a key question, but this is the unfortunate paradigm that has existed ever since nuclear weaponry was created. And when it was unilaterally wielded, it was America's dominance, and then now it's multilaterally wielded, and it's like, the nuclear powers get to fuck up their neighbors, and sometimes not their neighbors, sometimes nations 5,000 or 6,000 miles away, as we found out with the American experience. Here's the thing. So I think NATO if it was actually the European countries, has a lot of reasonable justification to be supporting Ukraine. Because, like, yeah, they are directly in the next domino line of attack, theoretically, especially if you guys' thesis is correct that Putin's a madman and he's going to try and take over Europe. So I see full justification for the European members of NATO to be shipping out weaponry and doing whatever they want to do. I don't see any real argument for America to be leading that charge. I mean, we give more in weaponry and aid, at least in financial terms, if you're right about the accounting tricks. I'm not confident that you are, but regardless, say that's the case, we're still giving them more than the rest of NATO combined from what I've read. Is that accurate?
When it comes to weapons, yes. Per capita, no, but in sum total, yes.
Oh, yeah. Okay. Well, yeah, sure. Yeah, not per capita, but I mean, we are the primary, defending munitions.
One important caveat there, just because, for example, because the other day we had a huge attack here in Kyiv, 15 Russian missiles, and we were protected by F-16s and French Mirage jets. But the important point, and here's the other sticking point, which could come up later in future conversations. The F-16s were donated by Denmark and the Netherlands, but Washington had to get permission. And that was the other thing. Europe really wanted to do a lot more. Some, not Germany, but smaller European countries wanted to do a lot more. And Joe Biden delayed and said, no, you can't do it. It wasn't even American stuff. It was because it was using American tech. That's maybe a debate for a different time, but very important to point out.
No. But I think this is exactly the point that I'm making, is that there are different impetuses for action that exist and different calculuses that must be made on a nationalistic analysis. Like, if you're a Eastern European country, you have a fucking lot of reason to be like, I want Ukraine to win this war. I think that this is the problem with having America be the leader of NATO, is that doesn't make sense, because from our calculus, we don't have the same impetus. We don't have the same dire catastrophic consequences if the Clint Russells of the world are wrong and that Putin is going to roll across Europe. So this is why I want America out of NATO. And I'm sure we're going to have a fiery debate about this perhaps, but I think that the interests are too at odds with one another, and that the decisions that want to be made, like, America should not have the capacity to veto whether or not Poland or what nations you said, I forget which nations were the ones.
Members,
yeah. If they want to ship fucking F-16s to Ukraine and risk Russia firing on Finland, that's their prerogative. That's I disagree with it, but that's their fucking call. So I think that just kind of demonstrates more of the reason I'm in opposition to America being the figurehead of NATO.
Yeah, I want to ask Clinton. I mean, I see a clash of, it's in a strange way, like very similar worldviews when it comes to a micro level, at least. But also on a macro level. I mean, I completely reject and despise the war machine, especially the way I think that they've abused Ukraine. And try to profit from it. Two questions into one here. In World War II, should the U.S. have gotten involved in any word? I know it's hard. There's so many different permutations, but
right.
Was that a good thing that somehow we helped liberate Europe and all that? And two, is it, especially if you look to the threat with China and all this, is it important that the American military is experienced and connected to the world and savvy? Two different questions.
Yeah, I mean, I'll go with the first one first. This is it's a counterfactual, kind of analysis. It's very hard to say if if the Third Reich was actually capable of conquering all of Europe and endangering America. Yeah, it's probably prudent for us to have gotten involved and to have stopped that. But I'm not sure that that's the case. I mean, from my analysis, it looks like it was really the USSR that defeated the Germans anyways. So do you think that, I guess I'll turn that question around on you. Do you think that given what he did in invading Russia, that he would have ultimately fallen anyways?
Who would have fallen? That Hitler would have fallen.
That Hitler would have,
well,
yeah.
Well, first I was intrigued by what you said, that if it was a threat that all of Europe would fall, why would that still matter to the U.S.? It's across an ocean. Why would that matter?
No, sorry. I was saying if all of Europe were to fall and then it were to endanger the U.S.
How would all of Europe falling endanger the U.S.? in
Well, I mean,
1940.
the argument is that if they were to conquer all of Europe and then conscript those men and then create the ships and decide to invade America, like the idea, or at least the argument, is that they were interested in total global conquest. And if that's the case, then yes, I mean, it does make sense. This is neocon argumentation that you must stop them there so you don't have to fight them here. Well, I can't say that would have actually transpired. Had it, then yes, our intervention is just.
Well, I would say, and it's almost like that TV show, The Man in the High Castle, where we get to see what would it be like if. But on this score, I would say Europe fell, and I say this, and it pisses off the Hungarians especially, but also the Poles. They caved. They fell, both to the Soviets and to Hitler. They all caved. The French, they all caved and fell. It was all left to Churchill and the UK. Europe almost did totally fall, except for the UK.
No, I know.
And what we see now is that not happening because of this big Eastern European country where it's the Texas of Europe and people that actually believe in freedom. And I think it's okay, you could say it's a hypothetical counterfactual, but it's actually important to point out. In 1945, in 1939, countries like this just collapsed. Czech Republic, Czechoslovakia, they all collapsed into totalitarianism, into the war machine of Hitler. And what we see now is a country that's saying we're not going to do it. Even though it's insane, and we should because people want us to give up. And there are moments when everyone here gets stressed, and they're like, oh, okay, fine. We give up, and you guys have fun. See what it's like. I mean, there are moments when people say that a lot, even recently now. Like, the largest country in Europe is Ukraine. Incredible resources. Now, incredible military resources. Incredible innovation. Now, I don't totally buy this because I know the Ukrainians... they believe in freedom too much. They would always resist. And they would never use their skills in fighting Europe, for the most part. I just know that to be true. And I think that makes it even harder for people to realize that if Ukraine did fall, what a menace this would be. Because imagine, you're Putin, you conquer Ukraine, especially now after 3 years. Okay, if it was 3 days, it might be different. But now you've done this, you're badass.
You don't think that the Polish have a similar fighting spirit given their historical experiences?
Why don't we wait? Why don't we just wait and find out? Like we did in World War II.
Well, that's basically what I'm arguing is that we ought to wait and find out. But I don't know the answer. I mean, this is the one thing. This is the one thing. This is the one thing that a lot of non-interventionist libertarians won't acknowledge, and I will acknowledge it. That we don't know. Like I am not saying I have a crystal ball that says if America stops arming the Ukrainians that Putin doesn't end up conquering all of Europe. I don't know that for a fact. I'm just saying I'm skeptical of it. I think that the statement is spoken with a tremendous amount of authority from the people that disagree with me. And I think that they're speaking with an authority that's probably not justified either, because they get a lot of things wrong in their analysis historically in foreign policy, whereas the Ron Pauls of the world have been right more often than not, and I come from that school. So I'm just asking that everybody consider the non-interventionist position and whether or not all of this is every single current modern conflict must be analogized to World War II. And it's always the next Hitler. And it's always about stopping them there so we don't have to fight them here. We made the same fucking retarded arguments when it came to Iraq, for God's sakes.
Well, that's the boy who cried wolf type of thing.
Well, that's the problem. Yeah,
that one was obvious. This one is less obvious. So I'll give that justice.
But I'll put it this way. If we're weighing things in the balance, and saying, because, it's a gamble.
No, you're right. It is a gamble, but it's also a gamble to go along with your counter arguments that because Putin has withdrawn when we gave them HIMARS, that this is you just keep going. Just give them more. Give them F-16s. Let's put nukes in Kiev. Let's let them do whatever they want.
No, but it's more than it's been. And here's what I say in the gamble. If you're trying to weigh this in the balance, and you do reasonably acknowledge that, if all of Europe fell, that could be a huge problem, especially now when we're more interconnected than ever. Then here's the balance. We have a situation where no one is asking for other foreign soldiers to fight. Ukrainians are totally willing to do it. They've done it so far for 3 years. They've held the line pretty well. And every single time, you could plot like 17 different Putin's major red lines. For example, Pete Hegseth the other day talks about the vulnerability of the American Navy. Ukrainians, they don't have a navy. With drones, they destroyed Russia's Black Sea fleet. And from the very beginning, from summer 2022 to summer 2023, there was a negotiated deal with the United Nations and Turkey that allowed Ukraine to export a limited amount of grain through the Black Sea. As a result, they couldn't fight in the Black Sea. And Russia controlled it. There were still some attacks. And then the whole deal fell apart in July 2023. And within weeks of that deal falling apart, Ukrainians began to use sea drones to take out the Russian Black Sea fleet. And now there is more grain exported through the Black Sea than there was before the full-scale invasion. No one talks about it. It's amazing. The Black Sea fleet is either, most of it was destroyed. The rest of it, the Russians had to move from Crimea, from the port that they want the most. They had to move it from there because it was too dangerous. They moved it to mainland Russia. The Ukrainians destroyed Russia's navy in the Black Sea extraordinarily. They actually sent missiles, right? British Storm Shadow missiles, quite an escalation. A nuclear red line they crossed, and they hit the headquarters of the Black Sea Fleet in Sevastopol.
Yep,
that was
I remember
years
it well.
ago, because we're like years now, right? That was in 2023.
Yeah.
So we see time.
No, I've covered all of these escalations. Yeah.
Well, you call it escalation. You call it fighting back. You call. It's escalation.
You just called it an escalation.
Every time you score,
you just said it's a major escalation.
Well, in Putin's mind, okay, fair, but Putin's mind, it was a crossing of a nuclear red line, and it was literally a crossing of one of his nuclear red lines, and yet
I remember.
But what happened? Putin withdrew the fleet, and so what I'm saying is, if we are really concerned about this possibility that and that's the thing, maybe we're not concerned about it. That Putin would actually could go further. But if that is a concern, is it not a good deal that you support, you give some weapons to Ukraine? Ukrainians they actually improve the weapons. Every time they get these weapons, they're able to push the Russians back. And so at some point, we get to the point where there can be a real deal where is maybe some no man's land, Donetsk or whatever. But a real deal where Europe is fortified, and we don't even have to get to this hypothetical question of what happens if Europe falls. That seems to me a better solution.
Yeah, well, I mean, you're assuming that one of those red lines that gets crossed doesn't actually trigger something serious. So if our aid and defense allows this war to end without Europe and NATO being dragged into a hot war with Russia, yes, that is preferable to a hot war between NATO and Russia. I'll grant you that. I just don't think that that's probable. That's been my analysis for years, and I think that Russia has demonstrated that they're not interested in having a war against NATO. Now, there's again these countervailing points of like, well, Ukraine can beat Russia, but also Russia can beat all of Europe. But it's like, I'll grant you that, the Ukrainians have a greater fighting spirit. But in terms of all of the weaponry that the Ukrainians are getting by which they can then prevail with this fighting spirit that is maybe exclusive to them and not held by the rest of Europe, those weapons are held by Europe. I mean, they have an immense capacity to defend themselves, including nuclear weapons. I just don't think it's likely that you actually see a ground invasion or a bombing campaign against the rest of Europe if Ukraine is to fall. I think that you and I once again are having major differences in takeaways from these events. In that JD Vance's speech yesterday, which by the way, everybody watching, listening right now, if you haven't heard the entirety of the speech, I did an episode at noon today where I listen and give commentary on the entire thing, and it's fucking fantastic. His argument is not about strength. He is not arguing about, getting tough and being stronger to withstand the inevitable invasion of Russia. It is completely not what he's saying. What he is saying is that the enemies of democracy, the enemies of humanity, exist in that room. The people that he's talking to, he's talking to the heads of NATO and the heads of all of the European governments, and he's saying, you censor your people, you cancel elections. You're not fucking defenders of democracy. You're the biggest threats to it. That speech is not about, even though it's the Munich Security Conference and you would expect it to be about, how are we going to defend ourselves and blah, blah, blah. That is not the thesis that he's functioning from. And it was really profound. So I hope people will check that out. I think that is my biggest concern. Like this is, and I think this is what many of the Make America Great, America First, and also the libertarians feel right now, is that yes, Putin isn't a good guy. No doubt. I never argued, despite the fact that I'm called a Putin apologist and that I fucking love Putin. That's never been my actual worldview. My concern, my primary concern, is that our government is a huge fucking problem. And it is clearly the biggest threat to my liberty personally. And it has been. I was just locked in my house 4 years ago. Like we have serious problems. So that is my priority. That is the focus. If we were some bastion of liberty and, we didn't have 50% tax rates and we didn't have one of the most regulated economies in the world, then maybe we can talk about bringing freedom and democracy to the rest of the world. Maybe at that point.
I don't think Joseph would disagree with that, right? A lot of these are, I think, very valid concerns. And I think one of the biggest concerns for me this whole time was that the United States government under Biden was focused so much on doing things that I think turned a lot of people off from even thinking about Ukraine, because why would I ever want my money to go to this country that I don't even know when all these problems are happening here? And, how dare they talk about, the barbarity of Vladimir Putin, where there's all these anti-liberty things that are going on in my home turf. And the problem is that a lot of these bureaucrats, they can address a lot of these things. They can address the fact that they arrest people for, Islamophobia or things like that in Europe. So until they do that,
or praying outside of an abortion clinic.
Absolutely, absolutely. I completely agree with you, Clint. That's a problem. But that's this dialectic that I've been so, angry at for all of these years, that we can't come to any good consensus. But it almost feels like, I don't know, Joseph, it almost feels like it is shifting a bit as far as some of the pro-Ukrainian people. Maybe now they're thinking, okay, we don't have to toe the line of the Biden administration anymore. Maybe that's going to free us in order to, maybe be a little bit more palpable for people who were so turned off because of this association.
Well, this of Ukraine is, and this is, for me, it's a tragedy, and this is during the Biden administration a tragedy, but also, and I blame the media for this. I blame the USAID funded media here and throughout Europe for this. You couldn't tell the truth about Ukraine. I told you, Clinton left, that I was traveling the world. I sold my story to Hollywood. They made a TV show. I wanted to get away from America because it was too much. And Russell Crowe played my boss. Some guy played me. And I just took off traveling. And I was in Sweden in February 2020. And I was invited to give a lecture at a university in Western Ukraine. I came down here. Then everything shut down travel-wise for the pandemic. And I had a chance to leave. And I said, I think this is going to be one of the freest countries in the world during the pandemic. And it was. Ukrainians, they have one of the lowest vaccination rates, by the way. And they, unlike a lot of Americans who are complaining about the vaccine, Ukrainians actually didn't take it to begin with. And out of the ones who are registered as...
Neither did I, just for the record. Go ahead.
And out of the ones who are registered, and they're like 28% that took it, most of that is fake. From girls that sing in the church choir, to medical doctors, to politicians, to the most badass warriors. They just didn't do it. And they had the skill from the Soviet times, just be quiet, don't be loud about it, just ignore the government shit. And that's what happened. And it was an amazingly free place. You had
civil disobedience,
because there was the only country in Europe. You had a lot of really great African American musicians from the U.S., black musicians coming here because they could play. There were festivals and concerts. Incredible free society, and I think this is why Russia has wanted to destroy this. This country is too free; you can't be controlled, and why Europe and why Biden and the U.S. were so lethargic about supporting Ukraine, because it was too damn free. And you can't. They don't want that example of freedom, and that for me, that's the main. That's the main thing about it. This is
it's an interesting
outpost
argument
of America, and more than Greenland or anything could ever be. Truly, this deep sense of freedom, and you know it when you come here. It's been impossible to articulate that, because if I try to tell that story, which I did a few times, when Biden was president, you were totally restricted. I wasn't allowed. There was no outlet that would let you report the fact that this is one of the lowest coronavirus vaccinated countries in the world. You weren't allowed to say it.
Yeah.
It was cut off. And so no one knows that
not
story.
back then.
And so already, in addition to your arguments,
in part because our media is funded by the same USAID that controls Ukrainian media.
Putting the reporters here, and I consider a lot of the. I mean, there's a few good reporters I really respect here from America. A lot of them I consider enemy agents. They secretly love Russia. They don't understand freedom. When they come to Ukraine, they don't like the free speech here. They're offended by everything because this is a very free society. And so, like beyond, like I see the other arguments you make, but one of my missions is to break through the filter bubble and at least show, like when so often, like, you know, some American conservatives will praise the people of Poland or Conor McGregor in Ireland for standing up for stuff. Ukrainians are actually fighting and bleeding for everything we say we believe in, everything. But by we, I mean like the new administration, the MAGA, the Doge, all that.
Sure.
The 2014 revolution reduced the Soviet government to zero. All the institutions were deleted. And so I think there's a lot we can learn. You know, Ukrainians and Americans can learn from each other on this. This story is never told, and there's a reason why. So as a result, like, you know, when I listen to the, you know, reasons, and I think, Clint, you have more thoughtful reasons that you thought a lot about. But when I listen to, including people I know, friends of mine who work in the White House, they oppose Ukraine for the wrong reasons. They oppose Ukraine because they think this is some, like, you know, rainbow booster everyday nation, all this shit. It's just not. And it's a very tolerant country because there's true respect for free speech. And that part of the story is never, ever. I told it on my radio show every day. Maybe that's why it was canceled. But it's never told in the media whatsoever.
Oh, before Clint responds, I have a quick follow-up for you, Joseph. Would you say that there was a certain left-wing group that was in Ukraine that was the one that was promoting a lot of these associations with progressive policy and all of that? And what exactly was the source of that, and what is the state of that right now?
No, I mean, I remember in Lev, in 2022, when, you know, all these people were showing up in Lviv, and there was someone from the British media, and they're like, "Oh, Joe, what is the Ukrainian left? You know, the pacifist left in Ukraine. What are they doing?" I said, "They're fighting." I mean, Ukraine's the only place where I was at a concert in Lviv, and there was like a girl with pink hair, like punk-looking girl, singing traditional folk songs and raising money to buy drones to kill Russians. You know, for our friends at the front. Like this, the left and the right is, you don't see that distinction here. And I think that's part of the reason why Americans can't understand Ukraine. Like, the Polish conservatives are very close to Trump because they're like, oh, you know, we're attacked by the liberals. And like, I would put it this way: if Ukraine was being invaded by immigrants, like men from Africa, on shitty little boats through the Black Sea, then MAGA would stand with Ukraine totally, at least in speech. They would say good things about Ukraine because they can understand it. But because Ukraine is being invaded by the worst type of illegal immigrant, which is those who come not in shitty little boats, that's a problem. But when they come with fucking tanks and ballistic missiles, that's the worst type of illegal immigrant. And Ukrainians are standing up to the very worst. But because it's such a different thing, no one can even imagine it. And I think when I hear JD Vance, I mean, I appreciate JD Vance's philosophy, and I'm glad he's vice president. America needs that type of intellectualism and grounding back to our roots and what is our identity.
Agreed.
And it's very good that he's asking Europe to ask. And this is why it was an amazing moment at Notre Dame, the reopening of Notre Dame de Paris. It was one of the smart moves from Macron when he brought together Trump and Musk and Zelensky to say, you know, let's remember our ancient roots and heritage. But that exists here, and people are willing to fight for it here. I just wish, at the very least, even if you don't think it's worth supporting, that this could be understood by MAGA, by America.
I agree with you. I think that is the sad casualty of war propaganda on both sides, is that you get narratives, especially the non-interventionist narratives, which I usually am the one espousing, that will diminish the genuine plight of those that we don't want to assist, you know, like, or the courageous nature of their fight. Like, so I've said it multiple times, but I'll say it again. You know, anybody that's willing to fight an invading army is way more heroic than me. You know, like, they're fucking awesome. But it just doesn't change my calculus. And I understand from your perspective, especially knowing the people, especially having lived there for 5 years, that it may have changed your perspective on this in a way that maybe my perspective would be changed too had I lived there for 5 years like you have. But from my vantage point, from born and raised in America, I just think that the risks that come with your prescription here are risks that I'm not prepared to take, and I have been forced to take them for the past 2.5 years or 3 years now against my will, and I don't appreciate it. That's really how I feel about it.
As far as last questions go here, I want to make sure that we don't go as far away from what Clint pointed out right now, because I think that this is short of, bad faith actors who I think are in all kinds of different podcasting influence spaces. I think that, Clint, you are somebody who is extremely good faith, and you're somebody who has a lot of principles. So I think that the matter of trying to figure out, well, what is it exactly that could possibly be brought into the conversation to make things clear? I don't know, Joseph, do you think that this is impossible just based on there being like this true unknown of whether Putin is going to go into, Poland, the Baltics, yada, 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 after the fact, or what? Is there any way at all that this could be cleared up?
I would say, firstly, Lev, credit to you. Thank you for bringing us together here with Clint and me. I think this is precisely what we need more of. I mean, the world is on fire. It got much worse under Biden's presidency in a very scary way. Middle East, the Taiwan threats, all this stuff, and the problems in America, and Biden's absolute tone deafness, announcing $8 billion coming to Ukraine when the hurricanes in the Carolinas, which wasn't even new money. It was just, it was almost gratuitous, because that was money that Congress had approved before, and it was almost like a gratuitous stabbing in the heart of Americans. And so
you hand out $700 to North Carolina, or to what was it, North Carolina? But yeah, you hand out $700 to people that lost everything, that have been paying taxes to the system forever, and then you hand out billions to people 6,000 miles away. Not going to land real well.
But more than that, but he didn't actually hand billions to. He was announcing the delivery of weapons that Congress had ordered him to send, that Mike Johnson had ordered him to send in April, and that's how much they didn't care. And that's why I'm happy to see the destruction of the bureaucracy. That's how much they hated free people in America and in Ukraine. Because I think they must have known by timing it in that way, he delayed that batch of weapons and support. He made it sound like it was new money, which it wasn't. And he by doing so, he perfectly hurt Americans and perfectly hurt Ukrainians. And this is the garbage that is gone now. And we can say that freely.
Can I just say something too? Because I think that what makes the analysis of these wars extraordinarily challenging is that, we actually opened up this discussion with this back and forth of what was this Burisma thing all about? Why did the vice president's son sit on the board of multiple companies in Ukraine?
Russia, by the way, not Ukraine.
Oh, okay, but it was inside of. I mean,
no, it was in Moscow. This is the key detail. I have to be insistent on it.
He was in Ukraine, was he not?
No, he had been in Ukraine, and the Ukrainian people, they had their own Trump revolution. They kicked the whole government out. They sent them fleeing to Moscow in 2014, including the CEO of Burisma. And only when he was in Moscow, and the testimony of Devin Archer, Hunter Biden's business partner, he said this before Congress in 2023. He said the same day that Putin took Crimea, he was meeting with the CEO of Burisma in Moscow. Burisma opposed Ukraine's revolution because they couldn't control this country anymore. They couldn't control free people. They wanted to pillage and get its resources. And so what did they do? They paid off the son of the vice president, Biden was in charge of Ukraine policy. Obama didn't care. He put Biden in charge with Jake Sullivan. Biden in charge of Ukraine policy when Ukraine broke away from the grip of Russia in 2014. Burisma, whose CEO had fled to Moscow, whose energy assets were in the Crimean Peninsula, which for 3 weeks was in the control of the free Ukrainians, pays the son of Biden. And what does Biden do? They choose not to help Ukraine. I mean, this is the quid pro quo. Burisma was not Ukrainian. It was anti-Ukraine.
Okay, but the point I'm making is that it wasn't even just Burisma. He was also on the boards of other corporations that were inside of Ukraine, and one of them had research that they were funding into biolabs, according to Victoria Nuland. Now, whether or not they were biolabs or bioweapons labs, you can assume which one I believe it was. But the point that I was trying to get across is that because the U.S. State Department and the U.S. empire, or whatever you want to call it, has its fingers in so many pots all over the world, that when there is an invasion from a nation like Russia, it makes the calculus, the analysis of like, all right, what was the impetus? What was the, like, who did what and why? And like, why do we have Victoria Nuland on the ground? Even if she's just handing out cookies, why the fuck is she there? Like, there's all these examples of, because of America State Department intervention, that you can no longer get a unified support for the Ukrainians, because people like me have been convinced that I think that this is largely been driven by our own State Department from the beginning. So why the fuck would I get behind what the State Department is telling me we have to do now? Like, this is, so my argument is this: they shouldn't be doing those things. They shouldn't be
Clint,
they shouldn't be funding billions through USAID and creating all of these problems.
Clint, I completely agree with you on it. I'm an opponent of their type of intervention. I've seen how they tried to actually limit. The only place they want to create democracy is where people hate democracy. And then the place where people actually are democratic, they want to stop them. We'll get into their psychology, but it's all about power. And these are the people who think God seems to be on the way out. They have, going back to, again, George H.W. and Condi Rice with that speech, the Chicken Keef speech. Stick with Moscow, guys. And free people don't want that. And Clint, I would say, I would invite you, with Lev, it would be great to come to Ukraine if you want.
Let's do
You can
it.
see whatever you want. We'll make sure you're as safe as possible. Again, it's safer than it might be safer than Miami. But seriously, I invite you to Ukraine, and we'll show you the country.
Yeah, and the whole Tower Gang. Bring the whole Tower Gang with you.
Please,
do it.
Sure, seriously.
Hey, seriously though, I do really appreciate the time from both of you and Lev. Great selection of opponents on this, because
not opponents. These are not opponents, Clint.
No,
they
are.
Like,
they are in terms of like our conclusions, but in terms of I think obvious good faith on both sides, and that's rare in internet blood sports debating. So you chose well. I hope that the audience takes more of the good faith arguments from both sides and is able to internalize those and consider them, because oftentimes we're just forced to deal with bad faith arguments on both sides and like choose which bad faith argument you want to believe in. I think this was not that, and so thank you guys.
I appreciate it very much. It was a great pleasure to have you, Joseph, and yourself, Clint, on BTR. This is what we do. We bring people together, as opposed to, dyeing our hair purple and then making a video of us blowing the dude and then, being all giddy when somebody finally releases it online, and being an asshole to people all the time and, creating
Shots
a lot
fired.
of this negative
Destiny.
energy.
My goodness.
Yeah, no, I really don't. I don't know. That guy just likes to argue. And here's the thing. He may be right on certain things, but the fact that you have somebody like that for a long time has been representing, the side of these, liberal intellectuals, I just think that was, that's pretty horrible. And
I would encourage people to, if they're bored and want to do this, go back and watch my debate with Destiny from 2 years ago, and you get to judge for yourself if my analysis was more grounded in reality than his, because he speaks with such an authoritative nature and he's so cocky. He got nothing right, like literally nothing. He's like this war is going to end. Russia's going to have its tail between its legs by the end of the year, and blah blah blah. Like they just get it all wrong, and they never reflect. They never have that actually held up to them as like, hey, do you care? Do you care that you got everything wrong? But I think it's important that people are more,
entire media and all the experts.
Me too.
Yeah, so we agree on a lot actually. And as you
Joseph,
were describing,
yes.
Sorry, no, I'm saying as you were describing that, I have no idea what the hell you're talking about, and it's weird. Like there's some things in war you appreciate that you just don't have to give a shit about that stuff because we got missiles falling on their heads. So
about Jenna St. Clair or whatever her name is, getting Musk's baby. He's gonna have like clones of himself probably, running the world in a couple of years.
I gotta say real quick, because she's a friend of mine. I've hung out with her. I mean, not like a great friend, but we've hung out 7-8 times, different events and shit like that. That news shook me to my core. I was like, what? She was on Liberty Lockdown, and then apparently, like a couple months later, she was, with Elon. So life is very strange.
Yeah,
Very,
I mean,
very
look,
strange.
God bless her. I just want to see. I just want to see a lot more of less slop type content. I want to see a lot more content that's has these deeper conversations like we do, and that's why I'm incredibly thankful to the fact that we are able to do this. And I really appreciate your time.
This is exactly the conversation that needs to happen, and I think we've got very close to the key questions that the whole world has to answer. So thank you for that.
Agreed.
And good evening, y'all from Kyiv. Still under air raid alarm, but no bombs yet.
So if you go to x.com/JP Lindsey, I have it on the screen over here for everybody in the chat. That is how you are going to find Joseph here. And of course, the great Liberty Lockdown. You could find Liberty Lockdown on X at Liberty Lock Pod. And what are you guys working on? Any plugs?
Yeah, I would just say, just a reminder that the JD Vance speech at the Munich Security Conference was a fucking barn burner. It's only 20 minutes. I talk about it for 50, but Liberty Lockdown episode today just dropped, and people are loving it. I think that if you want to see my worldview, what I'm about beyond this discussion, that would be a good starting place. So Liberty Lockdown, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, everywhere.
Definitely check it out. And Joseph, anything to plug right now on your end?
Yeah, please follow me on X at JP Lindsley, as you said, and also on Instagram. My team here, we make videos. I really try to help people shift their, to ask questions that maybe the media doesn't ask about the situation here and around the world. At JP Lindsley as well. And if you go to UkrainianFreedomNews.com, my website, you can access. When I spoke every single day of the war for 10 minutes for 3 years, no days off on WGN Radio in Chicago. And it's a real journal of what it's like to be in life in war. And so you can go back and look at the archives. I'm pretty angry still that it was canceled. So is the audience. Maybe it'll come back in some new format. But you can go through the archives and feel what it's like to be in the war for 3 years. So UkrainianFreedomNews.com or at JP Lindsley, LINDSLEY.
Stay safe out there, all right?
Thank you,
Absolutely.
man.
And last comment we have over here from Jerry Mack, a great viewer of the show from Ukraine. Last 3 hours, it has been an air raid alarm, yet he was there with us.
Yes, but actually, no, I haven't heard any explosions, so it's calm so far.
Oh, he may be in a different part of Ukraine, like not.
No, it's an alarm here. It is an alarm. But,
an alarm. Okay, it is.
The
Okay.
drones are circa. I call it a dance macabre, and this is what they do. To confuse the system, they'll spend hours moving around the country, and then all of a sudden they start to converge. So maybe as soon as we hang up, it'll be fireworks. I'll let you know next time.
Please stay safe out there. And guys, if you want to support the show, keep this thing going. Patreon.com/breaktherules. The link is in the chat. It's in the description. Become a patron today. And by the way, we're going to have a good friend of the show, Silicon Curtain, who I think, Joseph, he's going to be with Pascal Gobry, who I think, Clint, Pascal, right? He's the French gentleman on X. No? He goes by Peg sometimes. Peg. PG.
Probably.
He's got like the profile photo and anyway, whatever. That's going to be, we're going to be talking about Donald Trump and how, the world is kind of bending to his will right now and what exactly the repercussions, kind of the quote that he talked about today, with the whole law thing. But there we go. So it's an interesting time. Barron's probably going to become emperor, in a couple of decades. So we got that to look forward to.
I'll be Clint against an empire for sure. I'll
Please.
All right, guys.
All right, guys.
From Kyiv. Thank you to victory for freedom.
Thank you guys so
everywhere in the
much.
world.
Take care.